It's time for CKDU's No Time for Humour, with bloopers from the newsrooms of ATV-ASN Television.
I'm Ron Krostein from ASN News. My most embarrassing moment happened at the very beginning of one of our 7 o'clock newscasts about 2 years ago. Everything seemed to be routine. We were using backup cameras in the studio. Our regular cameras were out for servicing. And the news opening rolled as normal. And just as we were about to cut to the studio from the videotape opening, I noticed a lot of commotion behind the main camera. And I saw the cameraman literally jump back from the camera, crazed look in his eye on my peripheral vision. I looked up into the camera. Good evening, my name is Ron Krostein, in the news tonight. And somehow, what had been an unassuming studio camera had turned into a studio camera from hell. In the trade, it's called an eye sucker. That's when it's a rapid, super fast zoom in. What happened was there's something wrong mechanically with this camera, and the camera just automatically zoomed in on my face as fast and as far as it could go. So as I was saying, good evening, my name's Ron Krostein, I looked into the corner of the studio where the studio monitor is, and going on air was a total full-screen shot of my upper lip and mustache speaking out of focus. That was bad enough, but what made it worse was that in the control room, they just automatically and routinely supered Ron Krostein. So here was Ron Kronstein's upper lip mustache moving out of focus, and then just as fast as it happened again, it went back off. And of course, you're reading the news and you're coming into a major story from Ottawa or something like that. Now you have to continue on with the studio camera falling down. We did it, but that was, I can honestly say I've never seen my lip or my mustache that big before. It wasn't a pretty sight.
Hi, I'm Scott Matthews of ASN, and I suppose my most embarrassing moment would be one that happened, I guess it's about 3 years ago now. We like to say around the station that to top my on-air faux pas, you'd probably have to get fired. What happened is I did at that time a feature on Fridays called a Razzle Dazzle. It's a series of plays of the week. And I had back-to-back highlights involving a New York Mets player named Mookie Wilson. Now what I do when I do this show, I script it just in case I draw a blank. You know, all of a sudden at the last second you forget somebody's name. So I have a script just in case. And I'd written the script, best blown fly ball by a left fielder, George Foster with an assist to Mookie Wilson. They ran together and the ball fell. The next highlight was Mookie Wilson dropping one on his own. So I said, and now watch the job Mookie does on this one solo. So somehow, as I read it, I did the George Foster blown fly ball, da-da-da-da-da, and I remembered the word solo and the word blown, and somehow I said, and now watch Mookie Wilson do a solo blow job. And needless to say, the second I said that, I knew that wasn't exactly the best descriptive terminology I'd ever use, and that would have to be my most embarrassing moment. Fortunately, of course, I wasn't on camera, and I wasn't on camera for another minute because these highlights ran another minute before I was on again. But I'll tell you, as you can guess, I'm assuming if you top that, you got to get fired.
Hi, I'm Carol McDade from ASN. I haven't had any embarrassing moments yet on television, but I'm sure there are a few that are about to happen. But when I started off in radio, I had to fill about 30 seconds worth before the end of the newscast, and I did a famous rip and read. And I grabbed a piece of wire copy about a Miss Georgia who was wanted in the British Commonwealth due to the fact that she had kidnapped a Mormon missionary. I hadn't read the copy over before I went to air, and the copy was extremely graphic. What she had done was she had kidnapped a Mormon missionary, hand-shackled him to a big brass bed in an old English cottage, and forced him to have sex with her, at which point I died laughing. Shortly after that, the telephone rang, and I got a call from the head of the Mormon church in Cape Breton, who totally lambasted me. However, the next day I found out who had actually called me. It was Greg Boone, my coworker. So it was just a long-running joke. But I have to tell you one story that literally did happen. Didn't happen to me, but it was a killer. I'm not going to say the fellow's name. He works for CBC now. But he, at the time of the People's Temple cult death, had the story first thing in the morning after a very hard night the night before, talking about the Jonestown Temple cult. And he couldn't say the word at 7 o'clock in the morning. He kept saying, "And the massacre at the People's Temple cult." He said he couldn't get the word right.
Well, I'm Duane Lowe from ASN. I'm supposed to tell you something funny that's occurred to me in my time of delivering the weather to the Atlantic region. And there's one time in particular I'd like to share with you. And if you saw it, I'm sure you laughed until the tears were coming down your eyes. What happened was my mics went dead for some reason or another. So I was chit-chatting away and delivering the weather forecast, and nobody could hear a word that I was saying because my mics were dead. And the floor director was making all kinds of funny gestures at me, trying to get across to me that there was a problem with the mics. And at first he thought that maybe my mic was turned off. And I didn't know what was happening. So here he was. I carry a Portapack mic that's usually on the waistband of my skirt or whatever. This time I happened to have a dress on, if I remember correctly, and it was underneath my dress. And he was trying to get at the switch to find out if it was on. Now, mind you, I was on the air. The camera was on me. So out of the corner, you could see somebody kind of pulling at my clothes, and it almost looked as if somebody was trying to pull my clothes right off. And I didn't know why he was doing it. I couldn't figure it out. Then finally, he grabs an extra set of mics, and he's sort of holding them in my direction from the corner of the screen. So I finally realized, hey, there's something the matter with my mics. And everybody was going crazy, as they always do when something goes wrong in the newsroom. I mean, the news director, or I should say the floor director, just goes nuts usually. Anyway, he was standing there with these mics, and I thought, well, if I take the mics, and maybe people will be able to hear what I'm saying. So I grabbed the mics, and I held them in my hands. There just wasn't enough time to attach them to my clothing. Anyway, that was really hard to do, because in one hand, my right hand, I'm supposed to be pointing to the map and whatnot. And my left hand, I hold a button which changes the graphics. So it was very difficult to try and hold these mics so that people could hear me talk. It was very confusing, to try and make a long story short. I know it's too late, but it was very confusing. And in my confusion, I was talking about the forecast for Newfoundland, and Newfoundland had a really bad week of weather, and I wanted to let Newfoundlanders know that I was really concerned about the bad weather they were having. I felt bad about it and whatnot, even though it's not my fault. So I had the satellite picture up, and there was Newfoundland just totally covered with clouds, and I started to say a hell of a lot of cloud over Newfoundland, but I got halfway through, and I realized that it was coming out all wrong. I ad-lib, by the way. Everything just comes directly from the brain to the mouth and out. There's no scripts for me to follow and no auto cue. So you can imagine what it's like when there's a lot of confusion in front of my face and I'm trying to talk on air. So it started to come out, hell of a lot of cloud over Newfoundland, and it came out hell of a lot, and I realized I was swearing on camera, so I changed it, and I said, hell of a lot, heck of a lot of cloud over Newfoundland. So, of course, that made it even worse. And to this day, whenever there's bad weather over Newfoundland, everybody in the station will point out that there's a hell of a lot of cloud over Newfoundland. You want to know what my favorite comedian is, and it's Howie Mandel. And the reason he's my favorite comedian is because I interviewed the guy for an afternoon show a couple of years back. And when I talk to somebody, when I'm interviewing them, I like to get to know them and let other people get to know them. But Howie Mandel, there is no way, once that microphone is turned on, he is in character, and he will not come out of character. Anyway, he had me laughing. I had to ask him serious questions like his wife, things about his wife, and is he planning to have children and whatnot. And every serious question I'd ask him, he'd come out with some really funny remark. I asked him about his wife, and he showed me this picture of this woman who was the ugliest woman I had ever seen in my entire life. This is on camera now, mind you. And, I didn't know really what to say. Should I say, oh, very nice looking lady, or... And then it occurred to me, my God, this is a gag. He's got a gag for every question. Anyway, I tried to get him out of character, and I just couldn't. The guy is a true professional. I just find him really, really funny. I like Howie Mandel, and he's Canadian, too.
Hello, I'm Bill Jessome from ATV. The thing that embarrassed me the most, if you want to call it a blooper, many years ago when I worked in television down in the United States, I was anchoring the 11 o'clock news, and about 45 seconds before airtime, I was in the studio at the anchor desk, but had forgotten something that I needed, and I picked up my scripts. There were no teleprompters in those days, of course. Those are the dark age days of television. and I went back out to the newsroom, which was only about 10 feet away from the newsroom itself, to get what I left there. But in such a hurry, I left the news on the desk and came back in, and during the opening billboard, and the voiceover announcer introduced, and now with the news, here's Bill Jessome, and I said good evening, and then I paused because my newscast was out in the newsroom, so I couldn't do anything but apologize and tell the people that what I'm about to tell them is sitting out on the desk, so if they bear with me or come with me, we'll get this show on the road. So I just walked back off the set, went out in the newsroom, and got the newscasting back in, and phones were ringing off the hook and said it was a great thing. It was a natural thing to do and not to hide it.
Steve Jacobs, ATV Sports, probably the number one blooper in the last 8-9 months would have to be mispronouncing regional names of towns, i.e. Muscadabuit for Muscadabit, Shubenapity for Shubenacadie. Now this, of course, was early on. This was not recently. The other blooper that really stands out would be the night that Bill Mackay killed my sportscast just as I was getting on the air. Through the computer, he killed the entire show. I had no scripts to read off of, and therefore had to ad-lib approximately 8.5 minutes of sports. Thank you, Bill.
You had a hard copy? You didn't have any script?
Only had half the hard copy because I was so rushed I didn't have time to pick up the other half.
Hi, I'm Paul Mennier from ATV Sports. One of my most embarrassing moments was when I was bringing up a young wench to the business by the name of Colleen Jones. We were doing the Sunday morning newscast on C100, and I had a story from Africa about some political tension there with Mr. Mugabe, and I called him inadvertently, one of those slip-ups, Mugabe. That was the end of my newscast, and I threw it to Colleen to do the sports, and I was laughing about my little blooper over his name, and that got her laughing. And then her first story was something about St. Mary's basketball team. I forget who the player was, but he was the smig man for Smew is what she said, and that got her going. That was it. 1-2 minutes anyway of unadulterated laughter, and the poor jock in the control room threw his hands up in the air. He didn't know what to do, whether to can our mics or just leave us on. He left us on. we just couldn't stop laughing. It was, and we tried. God, we tried. Turned the mics off, coughed, came back on. We were laughing again. So that would be one of the more embarrassing moments. Actually, there have been even more embarrassing moments than that, but in fact, some that have nearly cost me my career, but we'll gloss those over.
My name is Harrett Sullivan. I'm executive producer of ATV News, but for years served as a reporter and interviewer in various stages of radio and television. A guest who actually fell asleep in the middle of an interview. What happened was we had 3 people on the set in this 1-hour interview show, and 2 interviewers, in which I was one. It was an adversary situation in which these 3 people all had various differing opinions on the subject, but I can't remember what it was because this is back in the late 60s. In any case, one of the guests had come early and had a paper bag in his pocket and then was sipping from the bottle that was in the paper bag quite frequently before he hit air. As a result, under the hot lights and the pint of rum that he consumed before he went to air, he literally passed out right in the middle of the live interview. And the only way we could revive him was to continue to kick him off camera. In other words, my co-host would take turns and we'd kick him on the foot, hoping that was going to wake him up. Finally, after about the 3rd or 4th time, in the middle of this conversation, and the other 2 guests, of course, were sober and continued to talk, and we became quite put off when our guest began to snore. And it became very obvious even to the viewers at home that our guest had fallen asleep because he began to snore quite loudly. We kicked him very hard then, and he woke up. And when he woke up, of course, he for a moment did not realize where he was. But talk about a guy sobering up in a hurry when he suddenly realized he was live television and had just slept for a good 2.5, 3 minutes.
I'm Steve Murphy of ATV's Live at 5, and I have to tell you first that my stories are not nearly as good as Harrett Sullivan's. There again, I haven't been around as long as Harrett Sullivan. Not to say that he's old, because he is my boss, and I'd never say that about my boss. But there are 2 stories I can remember. Both of them are radio stories, and radio is a great medium for bloopers because it's just you and your microphone, and it's no better than the sum total of you and your microphone. And as I've discovered on a couple of occasions, your mouth and your microphone can get you in a lot of trouble. One story I recall very well was shortly after the invasion of Grenada. And there was an awful lot of news just then about the Caribbean. And I must confess that although I've been in the news business for about 12 years, I was not intimately familiar with all of the leaders of the Caribbean countries. And in writing an 8 o'clock newscast one day, I mistakenly identified the Prime Minister of one of those Caribbean countries. I believe that I was trying to identify Prime Minister Eugenia Charles. Somehow or other, I didn't, and I attached the wrong name to the country I was speaking about. And I realized as soon as I said it on the air that it was the wrong name, that I'd made somebody the Prime Minister of a country. And I went to correct it, and suddenly I drew a blank. The name had been on the tip of my tongue. I couldn't remember the correct name. I ummed and ahed for about 15 seconds. We had more than a little bit of dead air, and finally I looked up at the announcer and I said, "Who is the Prime Minister of that country anyway?" Because I just couldn't remember. And it turned out it was Prime Minister Eugenia Charles. Another story I remember, and this doesn't have to do with my mouth so much as my stupidity. I was doing the noon report on CJCH, which was a 10-minute newscast at the time. And I went into the studio smoking a cigarette. Didn't find any ashtray when I got in there. So I was sitting before the microphone with a cigarette in my left hand, no ashtray, but there was a garbage can on the left-hand side of the desk. And somewhat subconsciously, or unconsciously, I guess, I was flicking ashes into this waste paper basket, which, as you might guess, was full of paper and other things. So I introduced a report we had taped, and I went to take a drag on the cigarette, and I realized that there was no burning ember on the end of the cigarette, that it had, in fact, gone into the garbage can full of paper. Having to go back in the air, I realized that there was smoke coming from this garbage can, and I had no particular way to put it out. About 6 minutes left in the newscast, nothing to extinguish the fire, no more taped reports that would have given me a second to gain my composure and get somebody to get me a fire extinguisher or something. So finally, I had to end the newscast about 4 minutes early, and in a panic, I ran over to the men's room and got some water and came back and extinguished this burning garbage can, which by the time I got back was reminiscent of a smoke bomb.
My name is Bruce Graham. I'm the anchorman with ATV, and I guess the best blooper that I've had in the past 3 or 4 years anyway was in 1986, 1985. Dave Wright was doing Live at 5. Laura Lee Langley had just joined the staff, and they were talking, and I didn't realize that they were on the air, and I was looking over the wire, and a story came across concerning a recall of Gerber's baby food. And my producer was sitting down the other side of the newsroom, and Dave and Laura Lee were between my producer and myself, and I screamed, almost at the top of my voice, "Do you have the story on the recall of Gerber's baby food?" And Dave Wright, who is very seldom ever lost for words, turned around, his back to the camera, and looked at me, and he had the dumbest look in his face I have ever seen, and it went through my mind, oh my God, we're on the air. And Dave turned white, and his mouth fell open, and there was just a split second there where he had abject fear written on his face. Being the professional he is, he recovered quickly, and he started to laugh, and I started to laugh. And I didn't realize until later that poor Laura Lee, who was having her first or second week on the air, just about died. She didn't know what to do, and Dave and I were laughing, and naturally he recovered very well. But that was certainly one of the biggest faux pas I can remember.
Hi, this is Bruce Dorton with ATV-ASN News. A couple of my more embarrassing moments. One of them happened about 15 years ago. I was with the American Forces Korea Network, and I was in Seoul, Korea, working in news at network headquarters, and we had what was called a systems cue, where we would play a cart, and it said, "This is the American Forces Korea Network," sort of a station identification. But it was the cue for all of our stations along the line to join the network for the news. And I was getting ready to read the news, played the systems cue, "This is the American Forces Korea Network," and I went into my first news story, And the story had to deal with the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy. And I was quoting some remarks from the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, and I remember saying, and the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy went on to say, and then I pressed the button to hit the cart for his remarks, and the wrong button was pressed, and it came out saying, the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy said today, this is the American Forces Korea Network. And there was another time I was interviewing the Pointer Sisters about 10, 12 years ago, and I hadn't done my homework on them. And as part of the beginning of the interview, I asked the ladies, where did they get the name Pointer Sisters from? And it was Bonnie who looked at me and laughed and said, well, we got the name from our father, the Reverend J.D. Pointer.
Oh, hi, I'm Kelly Smith Tremblay. I'm a director at ATV. I direct live at 5, and on ASN I direct the 7 o'clock and the 11 o'clock newscasts. Probably my favorite blooper of all time has to involve Dave Wright. He was sort of notorious for doing things like this. He was reading an intro to an item, and it was about microorganisms, but Dave, being Dave, referred to them as tiny microorgasms, and the whole set just collapsed behind him. He didn't have any idea what he said at all, of course.
CKDU-FM's No Time for Humor was produced by Wayne Harrett.